Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Melinda Smith, and I am the Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary. Thank you for joining us for Collaborate for Change, Eliminating Systemic Racism in Calgary. In today's panel, we'll be reflecting on the City of Calgary's hearing on systemic racism a year ago and discussing the steps necessary to move forward together on an anti-racism action plan that responds to the urgent call for change. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that even though we are all joining remotely, I am confident that every single one of us is residing on the traditional territories of at least one Indigenous nation. I express my sincere gratitude for being able to call these lands our respective homes. I am located in Calgary, Canada, on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Today is an important day. The United Nations has declared March 21st the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. This day marks the 1966 Sharpeville massacre, in which South African police opened fire on Black civilians during a peaceful demonstration against apartheid laws. 69 people were killed then, mostly young, dozens injured. Decades later, racism still exists within our communities and our institutional structures. Last summer, Black Lives Matter protests around the globe reignited larger conversations on racism, challenging us all to consider how to dismantle racism within our schools, in our institutions, and the broader communities. Recent events in hospitals in Quebec, attacks against Muslim women in Edmonton, and anti-Asian racism attacks in the US and Canada reminds us of the urgent need to address racism. The City of Calgary responded to these calls. They held a series of hearings on systemic racism to explore what challenges exist and gain perspective on how to address them. I acted as a co-chair of these hearings. These were heated and challenging conversations, but they were also desperately needed. Today we have brought together many voices to reflect on what has happened in the year since these hearings, to share perspective on how to move forward on an anti-racism action plan. Our goal is to bring a variety of voices together to talk about how we can move forward and take action that is so desperately needed. First, I would like to welcome Councillor Giancarlo Carra, who will be joining me to co-host the conversations today. Councillor Giancarlo Carra is a two-time University of Calgary alumnus with a bachelor's in social sciences and a master's of environmental design. Elected in 2010, he is serving his third term as Councillor of Ward 9 in Calgary. GC, as he's affectionately known around town, believes that empowered communities drive a city to achieve success. In his 10 years of service to the citizens of Ward 9, Giancarlo has made significant progress in shifting the dialogue at City Council with city administration, local leaders, and a diverse range of stakeholders. Giancarlo's career as an award-winning urban design professional and as a community activist has been shaped by his fundamental belief in the principles of design-based civic engagement. Councillor Carra and I co-chaired the City of Calgary's hearings on systemic racism last year, and we will be co-hosting our conversation today. Thank you for being here, Giancarlo. Another U Calgary alumna, Teresa Wupa, was the first trustee and chair of the Calgary Board of Education of Asian Canadian descent. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in social work from the University of Calgary. Teresa was the first female member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta and Cabinet Minister of Asian descent from 2018 to 2015. Dedicated to promoting active civic engagement and volunteerism, Teresa has served on 30 committees and boards at all levels and founded 7 organizations, including the Asian Heritage Foundation, the ACCT Foundation, the Ethnocultural Council of Calgary, Action Dignity, and the Calgary Chinese Community Services Association. Her community service has earned her recognition, including an Immigrant of Distinction Award, the YWCA's Woman of Distinction Award, the Chinese Canadian Legend Award, the Queen Jubilee Award for Multiculturalism, and Community Services. Vicky Bouvier, another speaker, also a U of Calgary alumna, is an assistant professor in Indigenous Studies at Mount Royal University here in Calgary, and a doctoral candidate in educational research, specializing in curriculum and learning at the University of Calgary. She's a proud Michif Métis and born and raised in Calgary, and a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Her ancestral connections are to the St. Francois Xavier community of the Red River and the Boggy Creek, Manitoba. Her doctoral research is exploring how Métis people, born and raised in urban environments, practice and express their self-understandings both individually and collectively through using an oral model of learning and visual media as methodology. Nile Dabriello is a University of Calgary alumnus with a social science degree. He received his JD in 2013 from Dalhousie University in Halifax. He has been privately practicing criminal law in Alberta since being called to the bar in 2014. Nile was inspired to pursue his career because of the many social injustices witnessed by the abuse of state power toward ethnic and racial minorities. As a minority himself, his aim is to continue fighting for justice in the legal system and help change the climate of hostility towards minorities. He currently serves as a co-chair of the City of Calgary's Anti-Racism Action Committee. Another speaker, Heather Campbell, is a licensed professional engineer who has had a diverse 25-year energy career, including technical, commercial, and energy policy, as well as holding business advisory positions in petrochemicals, oil and gas, clean and technology, and innovation energy consultancies, and energy industries. Heather holds a Bachelor of Engineering Science degree in biochemical and chemical engineering from the University of Western Ontario, in addition to a Master's of Law in Energy Law and Policy from the University of Dundee. She is an engaged, lifelong community volunteer, actively sharing her talents, resources, and time by participating and often leading a purposefully diverse range of organizations. Heather is also a board director with the Calgary's Arts Commons, is a member of the Advisory Council for Western Engineering, the People's Warden at St. Stephen's Anglican Church in Calgary, and a commissioner with the Calgary Police Commission. She's also the former co-chair of Alberta's Anti-Racism Advisory Council. Teresa, Vicky, Nile, and Heather, thank you for joining us today for today's discussion. We will begin by asking our panelists questions about their perspectives on the hearings, on actions since then, and how to move forward. We'll also open up the discussion to take questions from you, the audience. We ask that everyone embrace today as an opportunity for courageous, for frank, for honest conversations. Some of what we heard in the hearings was difficult, challenging to hear. And the personal accounts of racism can be triggering for many of us who have lived the experience of racism in our daily lives. We all come together today in the spirit of trust and genuine need to address these deep, interpersonal, cultural, and systemic issues of racism. So my first question today is for my co-host, Councillor Carra. So a year ago, the City of Calgary decided to launch a series of hearings on systemic racism. Can you update us on what has happened since then?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with this esteemed group of amazing Calgarians. Yeah, that was a intense 3 days, and I certainly didn't have the triggering aspects of lived experience to deal with. I can tell you that myself and all of council was deeply moved. Some of us, I think, went into it with an understanding of what systemic racism was in an academic sense. Some of us in a lived experience. Some of us, I think, didn't really have much of an idea. But we all walked away deeply moved and understanding that 37% of our neighbors, the BIPOC community of Calgary, an incredibly diverse Canadian city, and it doesn't matter what the age, what the background, what the education level, what the socioeconomic circumstances of the speaker, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of BIPOC community members came out, and it became very clear that they have a much different relationship with our core institutions than the white majority in our city. And I think what we did at the end of that hearing, Dr. Smith, because we couldn't do anything but, was make a statement acknowledging the existence of systemic racism and pledge to start the very serious work of moving to an anti-racist stance for our city and its institutions. As you know, there was, I think from the start there's been some controversy about that, and I would characterize the position of Calgarians as falling into one of three camps since that moment. I think there are people who understand that systemic racism is a real thing, and it's therefore something we have to address and address forcefully. I think there is a lot of people who don't understand what systemic racism is, and they experience various levels of discomfort in dealing with that. And I think there are those who, whether they understand there's systemic racism or not, are committed to making sure we do not do anything about it. And what we're seeing is, I think, an inflection and a rise in overt racism by those elements of our population. We have tiki torches sitting in front of City Hall during freedom marches, so-called freedom marches. We've seen the response to the pandemic being co-opted by white supremacist agendas. Just the other day, in the Field of Honor of Union Cemetery, a Confederate flag was hoisted, replacing a Canadian flag. So obviously the battle has been joined. What we've done as a city is set up the institutional groundwork to make institutional change. The first thing that happened after the springtime hearings, after giving the police service, who also acknowledged the existence of systemic racism within their work, within their institution, they came to us in September and basically laid out their plan. And I have to say that I thought that the speech that the chief gave was spectacular. I think when we went into Q&A, things went off the rails a little bit, and what we saw was the beginning of this struggle between those who want to maintain the status quo, defend the police, and those who are interested in defunding the police. One of the most powerful things the police committed to doing was to pursue a defund to fund sort of approach, to start moving a lot of their work towards alternative service delivery model, and to do that in conjunction with community. The next things that happened were we had Organization Day at the City of Calgary, where we made good on our promise to establish an anti-racism action committee. Nile Dabriello, who sat through all of the hearings with us, is the co-chair of that work. And that committee is getting its feet underneath it, learning how to flex its muscles, and they will be weighing in on a number of things. This coming Monday at the City of Calgary's public hearing, we're talking about the Guidebook for Great Communities for Everyone, which is building a much more equitable framework for physical city building and neighborhood development. And I believe we've already had the Anti-Racism Committee weigh in writing, and I'm looking forward to them weighing in public on that. In the lead up also at Organizational Day, we appointed a much more activist police commission. Heather Campbell, who's with us today, joins us on that commission. We tagged off with the amazing Councillor Jyoti Gandek. I replaced Jyoti, and Councillor Farkas, who was expressing defend the police sentiments, was replaced by my colleague George Chahal. And the work is taking place there. The police have actually set up their own citizen-based anti-racism committee, and they have the commission has an anti-racism committee, and they have a citizen-based anti-racism committee. And the City of Calgary established the Community Safety Investment Framework, which is really an environment for spending money on alternative service delivery. And at budget time, the police came and offered $8 million of base budget out of their regular work to the Community Safety Investment Framework. And unfortunately, there was a bit of a defend the police battle that took place on council. And the resolution, while symbolically challenging, council decided not to take the police's money at that point in time, was financially good because council did establish an $8 million fund to put into that. And so now instead of playing with $8 million in our first year, we're dealing with $16 million. And the work right now is what does $16 million build us in terms of establishing an institutional response to systemic racism, to mental health and addiction, to alternative service delivery within our police. And the work is also continuing on many other fronts. So that is really the state of things a year in. I feel like I wish we could make Rome in a day and snap our fingers and be someplace different, but we are doing the work. And I think that it's difficult and it's constant and it is now fraught because we have people who are stepping up to actively fight the work. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So I will now, as co-host, ask one of our panelists. Vicki, can I turn to you? As we explore racism, let's look at it from its roots. I was really moved by the presentation you gave as a member of the expert panel at the Inquiry into Systemic Racism, and I hope that you can sort of dig into some of that with us here today for the record. What are some of the beliefs that fueled colonialism, and how have these beliefs impacted our formation of our institutions and structures here in Canada?
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Dr. Smith, and to these beautiful people who joined me today. Yes, the discussion that I proposed to Council and to all the listeners in July was really framed around understanding the Doctrine of Discovery. So the Doctrine of Discovery is really at its root racist, and it really is the foundation of the employment of colonialism in Canada. And so Canada and its origins are inherently racist because they brought over church laws from the Vatican who were to deem the people that were originally here unhuman or dehuman in order to then turn around and make them human, which in the source of the Doctrine of Discovery is to understand whiteness and Christian. So if you're not that, this image of what Europeanness looks like, then you're not us, and then we need to make you like us. But along with that then, because colonialism is a system, it's an organism, it then provides these characteristics and features. So characteristics and features of the Doctrine of Discovery is thinking about those that are not Christian as heathens, as savages, as barbarians, which when you are enacting your worldview, your just your essence of who you are and your way of life, and that is demonized, that is a conflict. So that created initial conflicts. But it also, what the Doctrine of Discovery had to determine, not only about humans, but then about land. And so colonialism, and particularly in Canada, settler colonialism is the mode of colonialism that we have. And settler colonialism is very distinct because you have to remove people from the land in order to have Canadian sovereignty. And so that's really important to really distinguish between, other colonial mechanisms, is that people had to be removed from the land and their view of the land had to be disconnected. So you'll see, land disputes, for example, right now. That is a huge sort of anchor to understand that European laws and legalities of land, so property rights, how we operate within land, was imposed on Indigenous people to be able to remove them. And so there's legalities that are embedded in that. One of the fundamental racist pieces of legislation in Canada is the Indian Act. So the Indian Act really governs who is an Indian, quote unquote, under the Indian Act, but it also sets up a system to govern every aspect of an Indian and their community's lives. So whether it's governance structures, the residential school came directly out of the Indian Act, which was directly in alignment with the Doctrine of Discovery, conversion, wiping out languages, the eradication of everything that was not European. And so within that process, we have these characteristics and features that are then imposed not only on Indigenous people, but the settlers. And this is how, when you're saying, Councillor, that you have people pushing back, it's because those beliefs are so ingrained in them over 500 years that they've become normalized and they have become true. So when you look at a person of color, you believe that what you're looking at, what you've been taught, is true. And that's very problematic. And the other part is what the Doctrine of Discovery does is it really distinguishes who has rights and who doesn't, or who's worthy of rights and who isn't. So you question, okay, so how many people in this country have the right to clean water? Because many people do not have the right to clean water. And so how many people have the right to protest peacefully? So after the protests and the marches that were happening, our province put forward a bill to really, cut people's right to protest significantly. Why was that? Because it was people of color that were protesting. If it was, people of European descent, which we've seen through the pandemic, those enactments wouldn't have been targeted for the same enactments that people of color are doing currently. And so when we think about the roots of racism came with colonizers, and it has really been employed through all systems. So when we're thinking about institutions, healthcare, education, any social services, even our structures, they're all colonial, embedded from racist ideologies. So the challenge that we have is to peel at those institutions and the policies and the structures to see what is racist. And I think we're inherently going to get pushback. And probably violently, I would say, because people have to give up a right for someone else to have a right that doesn't have a right. There's a lot of privilege that is embedded in that Doctrine of Discovery. I can have a right, but you can't. And so it's this, when we're thinking about racism, we have to really think about equity as well. Because equity is really important because of these racist ideologies, some people are automatically disadvantaged, automatically. Equality isn't lining everybody up on the same line. Equity is ensuring that every single person on that line has what they need to live their best and fullest life. And right now, that's not happening because some are privileged and some aren't. And I think the other thing we have to realize is our legal system and policies and structures, they protect those that are against racism. So we also need to address those policies and procedures that are protecting the very, very acts that are harming us and start protecting the people that are being harmed. Because right now it's reversed. And so I think those racist ideologies really need to be understood and looked up in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicki. And that's actually an important seg to a question I would like to pose to Teresa. And Teresa, I was really deeply moved and appreciative of the comments you had to offer during the hearings, but also the decades of experience and knowledge and policy relevant expertise you brought to the hearings. So I wonder if you would, given what's been discussed about the roots of racism within our civic structures in particular, what are your thoughts about the responses to the call for systemic changes to address racial discrimination from Calgary's public institutions?
Well, thank you, Dr. Smith, and thank you for bringing us back today for a discussion from picking up from last July. I would make some brief remarks, reflecting on what I heard last July, and also it's been an incredible challenging journey the last 12 months. I think for myself, who actually started a few decades ago doing cross-cultural awareness training and then anti-discrimination training, but it has been nothing like the last 11 months. So I would start by making a brief remark on anti-racist systemic change, which I believe requires sustained, integrated approach that addresses key components of the organization, institution. It should be integrated into the organization's overall strategic plan and business plan with identified barriers to inclusion, equity, and ensure that the institution is free of racism. And the action required to dismantle those barriers, as well as articulating the expected impacts. And this have to be done simultaneously at the governance, organizational culture level, policy, and administration level, human resources, and the professional development training level, communication, public relations, program, service delivery level, and client, community, stakeholder relations. We heard last July, loud and clear, the harm and the hurt of racism perpetuated by our systems on our citizens, our youth, and our students. We were reminded the deeply entrenched attitudes, biases, and power structures in our systems, as well as, and you used the word in your summary, the pervasiveness of racism in our public system. We saw the impact that communities came out to speak with courage, with vulnerability, with anger, disappointment, and frustration, but also of hope and expectations that maybe our institutions will do better this time. We can see our institutions responded with many activities and appreciate the update from Councillor Carra, because I was reading the material on your website, and I appreciate your update today, very encouraging, I must say. And as someone who actually been fighting the city since 1992. I'm very glad to hear about the $16 million, I have to say. So very pleasant surprise on this pleasant Friday. So I learned that the city and other institutions have responded by forming anti-racism focused positions and committees, programmatic resources allocated to communities and institutions, engaging personnel to develop an organizational assessment approach and implementation plan. Lots of departmental discussions, statements of commitment, and community engagement and consultations. So I think many of the different systems that have been mentioned here so far are engaged in rolling out activities with attempts to respond to the heightened focus on racism. But what I have also observed, reflected, and also learned from some of my colleagues in the different systems include some of the follows, include some of the top points I'm going to raise here. So there's thinking upon reflecting what our institutions are doing, of course within a short period of time, is the need for well-articulated vision, overarching statement and plan, as well as expected outcomes and impacts. I think that what I've learned from the past is, we see all these different activities, and lots of really committed good people believe in the cause, doing things, but over time, without the sustained support of the system, things just dissipated, right? So I think identify, articulate, the end statement, the impact and the intended outcomes, and also the need to move beyond awareness raising, acknowledgements, EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, events, and literacy, teaching people how to use these languages again, but articulate a coherent strategic action plan, as well as how the system will adapt and sustain the change. Lots of focus on sustaining the work. So EDI statements are often very broad. Few people in the world can say no to world peace. So, I think that we need to think about beyond that, that kind of very broad statements. People who have been invested in previous efforts are watching how institutions will address the required sustainability of the change efforts. We have yet to hear concrete plans on how institutions would actually commit themselves to sustain the engagement, listening to impacted communities, not just a few individuals on the committees in a large institution. And because we know that in most places within this institution, the voices of impacted communities, racialized communities, are really underrepresented. So how do you actually keep engaging the impacted community beyond the few individuals at the table? So we're looking at where and when would the public systems have the needed deep, serious discussion with research, because the issues at hand are complex and serious and deeply embedded in our organizations and at the personal level. What we will also be looking for are the critical discussions, examinations, and understanding on the complexity of the various racialized groups. I think especially the last little while really got me reflected on, well, first, Indigenous people are diverse. Black people are diverse. Black Canadians are diverse. Asian Canadians are very diverse. Chinese Canadians itself are diverse. And First Nations, right, mentioned, when and how will our public institutions proactively consider the moral responsibility of not lumping racialized groups for convenience? And at the risk of oversimplifying the issue, that will not yield the impact of true equity and fairness. Recent research is actually emphasizing the need for culture-specific interventions. So I think those are some of the things that I think we need to look at proactively. Failure to address group diversity and complexity, dynamic of race relations, may recreate divisions amongst racialized groups, as we saw in the 1960s, pitting one group against others. It is also about how institutions will work differently to engage racialized community members in meaningful ways. So oversights is this kind of lack of readiness to do this work may be tolerated at the early stage, but the time to demand higher competence will come, because the simplified strategy is not going to deliver the needed change for all impacted groups. So I think there's also a lot of talk, but we haven't quite heard a lot of this yet in Calgary, is the work have to be evidence-based. The action have to be evidence-based. Then the following question is, where's our decision and discussion on race-based data? And if it continue to be ambiguous or voluntary, then where are we going to start? Because where's the baseline? So I think how public entities in 2021 lead institutional change efforts that possess the required knowledge of diversity and complexity of the people and issues involved, balancing evidence-based intervention and the broader public goods, keep focus on the vision and deliver real impacts. And I don't use the word commit anymore. So I was looking for words last night, and so I don't know whether this one would serve. Safeguard sustainable change and public accountability. Some of the indicators and markers that some of us would be looking for as we move forward as a city, as a society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Teresa. I've got a question for Nile, who was a member of our expert panel and ended up canceling his his week so he could spend it with us at the entire hearing, and I think we bonded over that amazing experience. Back in July 2020, the Calgary Police Force, who were not participants in our hearing but were observing it with the rest of Calgary, they acknowledged they had an issue with systemic racism. What are some of the ways we can hold them accountable and allow for greater transparency in the police force?
Thank you for that. And pleasure to be here with all of you with this important discussion about the ongoing problem of racism. I think ultimately it was a great gesture from the Calgary Police to acknowledge that they have an issue with systemic racism. I would go so far as to say it's the epitome of the damage that can occur and that develops from racist attitudes and ideologies, to build on what Vicky was saying. Ultimately, when you think about how to start that issue and addressing Calgary, or the policing in general, is that it's about accountability and it's about transparency. And it's about trusting the experiences of community members and understanding how different that is. I think we've seen a wave of some of the outrage and some of the empathy that's been developed from some of the awful videos we see of execution of force, lethal force, outright murder at times from other policing agencies. And we've seen even within Calgary, when there is video capture of incidents, it forces people to believe it's happening. But until then, up until recently, it's almost as if we forget how much pain and suffering has occurred in the past. I think ultimately there's various ways in dealing with accountability and transparency. And what I would say is one way is through legislation, right? So we have the Police Act right now, but that's a provincial piece of legislation that kind of outlines how police can be disciplined and review processes for them. And I feel it's a very inadequate piece of legislation currently. So there is talk from the current government about amending that, but I think ultimately it needs to go further than the amended version. I'll go so far as to say that right now. That's how much change needs to occur. And then obviously is the transparency, and that comes from even within, that's something that's more, more focused as to what the Calgary Police can do. And it could be to demand a quick and transparent investigation into complaints that are made by citizens against the police. And this is just in relation to how to address systemic racism as it affects populations that, like I said, have negative experiences with the police. There's a whole other topic and conversation that I think has to deal with the transparency of how that organization is run. For example, hiring processes, hiring practices, and ultimately promotions, the chain of command. Anyone who's seen The Wire understands there's a whole political regime going on within any organizational structure that's that large. And it's, and I think another way is through leadership. And I think the conversation has become more easy to have due to leadership, for example, like Chief Neufeld. Just discussing these issues is a massive change from what we've been used to. Of course, that doesn't address all the problems, and I challenged, I've said this in discussions with Chief Neufeld myself, is that the ongoing leadership and demonstration to citizens, a much broader citizenry, about what's right and what's wrong in policing would help. It's not just when there's a video capture of police brutality. It's about when Indigenous people or Black people or Asians are targeted through violence anywhere, discussing these things. It's when a video does come out about policing, it's calling it out and not saying, oh, it's, I'm always baffled that there's no discussion. If something happens in Vancouver, it'd be nice to see the Chief of Calgary Police speak out against that type of policing and how it's not effective, it's not proper. And I think those discussions and hearing leadership do that, and that it falls down, right? Like it trickles down. And I think by doing that, officers themselves will start to have more courage and more, understanding as to, it's not just a discussion of do you support the blue or not. It's about understanding that there are things that should not be acceptable, in a modern society, and then understanding, of course, how when we see those things, it's a brief illumination into a much broader discussion about who is typically at the bottom of these societal structures. And those don't just occur because of policing. It comes from poverty, that comes from racist attitudes, it comes from lack of resources, lack of social capital in various minority community venues. But ultimately, again, there's many ways that it can be done. Like I said, accountability, transparency, and I guess clear and ongoing leadership and demonstration of proper discretion from all officers, hold themselves accountable, know that the public's watching, and again, just keep chipping away. And it takes advocacy, and it takes challenging the status quo.
Thank you for that, Nile. I really appreciate the comment and also your profound contributions to the hearings on systemic racism last year. So I want to ask a question to Heather. And Heather, you have had significant experience on the Alberta Anti-Racism Commission. Now you are a member of the Police Commission. So I would actually, given this breadth of experience at these different levels of institutions, what modifications and modernizations are you hoping to see in policing in Alberta, in Calgary, but more Alberta more broadly?
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Smith. I sit here and I think, well, geez, it's kind of nice that you all consider me and invite me, because I'm not a University of Calgary alumna, so I apologize for that. And I was the only member of this esteemed group who wasn't an expert on the panel in July. I actually was a speaker. So I come to this conversation and that question with a different approach. So I'll go back to July and talk about what I witnessed as a speaker to those hearings. So I actually spoke at the hearings on July 7th, very late at night, if I recall, and joined by phone. And I was doing that in my capacity as the co-chair for Alberta's Anti-Racism Advisory Council, the provincial body, which Teresa was a member at the time. And at that time, I really just tried to lay out, I would say, from a Calgarian perspective, I don't want to say the business case, but the value of addressing systemic racism. And at this point, I talked to it just very straight. It's just very straight. I said, look, you're looking at a reduction in financial capacity of your citizens. You're looking at a reduction in their social well-being. You're looking at negative impacts to health, including mental health. Racism directly erodes the health, prosperity, and well-being of Calgarians. If you're the city of Calgary, that's your entire job. So in my mind, it was important to lay that out and lay out the tangible impacts in my commentary. The other thing that I always say, and I said on the 7th, is racism is not a partisan issue. You, unfortunately, have racism under every government that has existed over time, and we will continue to have it. What we need to change is our attitude and our actions to be anti-racist. What I also saw at that time was the joint statement by Calgary Police Commission, Calgary Police Service, the relative unions, acknowledging, and for me, I thought that statement was historic, but it acknowledged that systemic racism exists in policing as it does across society. And that hadn't happened before in this city, in Calgary, and it hadn't happened before in Alberta. And I think it's important to pause for that and recognize the moment of setting one's hand to history. And I thank the leadership of the commission, Chair Benita Croft and Chief Neufeld and President Orr for their thoughtfulness and their work to put that statement together and to now put the work behind it to actually live it. So At the time, I was the chair, co-chair of the Alberta Anti-Racism Advisory Council. So I was looking at racism from a perspective of the 4 priorities that the council was looking at. And we were looking at that time, a section on recognition of internationally trained professionals and their credentials. We had a section on hate crimes and hate and bias crimes and a provincial hate crimes unit and structures around justice and policing. We had there were 2 other priorities around education and structures of the Alberta government, basically an Alberta government that reflects the plurality of Alberta. So taking away, we were in the process of launching our subcommittees on the Alberta Anti-Racism Advisory Council, and I knew where some of the recommendations were going. My time with the Alberta Anti-Racism Advisory Council came to a close in January of this year. The recommendations from the inaugural council are ready. The government hasn't published them, but there's meat there, and thoughts about dealing with hate and bias crimes. There are fundamental recommendations on structures for policing, for justice, and that's broader than just the Crown and the prosecution, and really understanding our entire system as it relates to racism and anti-racism. We have an absolute gap in the province around hate and bias crimes and processes to address hate and bias crimes. If you're in Calgary, you have a hate and bias crime unit with a few officers who do amazing work, and we saw that happen. Their work happen now that they're investigating the Confederate flag that was put up in Union Cemetery. That's that group and that team. So I applaud them. There's an equal team in Edmonton Police Service who also does that type of work, but I'm talking about 2 units across a population of 4.5 million Albertans. If you live outside of those 2 jurisdictions, how do you deal with your hate incident or your hate and bias crime? So there's an opportunity there to enhance and support the resolution of crimes of that nature. Nile mentioned the review of the Police Act. If I think about my role on commission, that's the basis of the legislation that I live in for far too many hours. But we are at a place where if you come with an understanding that policing in North America has its roots in racism, and that is the key, understanding that you will understand the need to reform and refresh our governing legislation to support and address so many citizens that have been left feeling unsafe and unserved by the processes that are outcome from that legislation. There's an opportunity to modernize our policing to reflect the way we operate now, to have unconscious bias training and anti-racism training embedded in the expectations for training of police. All of those things are there. There's an opportunity to leverage the leadership that's on the commission as the governance and oversight body for the Calgary Police Service. 5 of the 12 commissioners are people of color or Indigenous members. 8 of the 12 commissioners are women. We don't talk a lot about women in this province, but in Calgary, 8 of the 12 commissioners for the Calgary Police Commission are women. So it's a different dialogue and a different conversation about issues of justice and how you come about solutions because of that demographic. Councillor Carra mentioned the use of the alternative service model. That's an opportunity where we can actually have a better delivery model and a better support for community. It's innovative work. It's work where Calgary can have the opportunity to be a leader in this space. We're really just looking at an opportunity to embed the principles of anti-racism and equity, inclusion, and diversity in a modernized and I would say revised police act. I don't want to see us move a bunch of commas around. I personally am looking for a complete redo because there's some it's required and it's due. So I'll leave it there for modernization and and thoughts about where we've come from and where we're at now.
Thank you very much, Heather, and I want to. And also to thank Councillor Carra for his reflection on what's been happening since the hearing a year ago, and Vicky Bouvier for her contributions on the Doctrine of Discovery and the ways they continue to be reflected and reproduced in institutions and practices, everything from education to language to perceptions of otherness. And I want to thank Teresa Upa for her contributions on the ways in which we need to actually embed principles and practices of accountability and mechanisms and collect race-based data and mechanisms for review, but certainly within leaderships and in institutions. And Nile, I really deeply appreciate your contributions on what's necessary to rethink policing. And again, all of you highlight the importance of the role of leadership and of governance and accountability mechanisms. And again, Heather, again, for your kind of breadth of experiences. And we do look forward to the release of the recommendations you highlighted from the province, because those are necessary to actually address racism. And we started this session today actually reflecting on the persistence of racist acts, from tiki torches raised by Councillor Carra, the Confederate flag, the attacks on Muslim women in Edmonton, the increasing anti-racism, anti-Asian attacks. And we began this journey reflecting on anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. So racism remains salient, and the need is urgent for us to address it. So the floor is now open to members of the audience. Please submit any questions you may have using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. If you would like the questions directed to someone in particular, please indicate who is your submission. So we're going to take turns, I think. I'm going to start with my co-host, Councillor Carra.
Thank you so much. I'll jump in with the first question from the interwebs. Larissa Lay thanks Vicky Bouvier for very clear explanation of the violence done through the Doctrine of Discovery. Thanks Teresa Wupa for how you've talked about the necessity of culturally specific interventions. She believes this is right. She asks, if the framing culture is Eurocentric and racist, what can the role of cultural work be in shifting the frame? And she's specifically asking about the role of storytelling, the arts, and the humanities. We carry meaningful knowledge that is not necessarily data-oriented, but is culturally specific and valuable. So who wants to jump in on the role of the arts, storytelling, and the humanities in creating different frames for us to work together on?
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Larissa. The arts have become a very important modality for expressing experience for BIPOC people. And I think the more that people in general expose themselves to those artistic expressions And they're often very political. They are often very outright calling to people to be attentive to those experiences, much like what Nile was saying, is that we have to listen to the experiences of those that experience racism. You know, there's a lot of storytelling around the residential schools, the impacts of the residential schools, but also the 60s scoop. That's another huge legacy of racism in Canada after the residential schools started to be closed. And so I think Larissa's right. Those modalities of storytelling are really, really key for Indigenous expression and experiences. But I also think on the other flip side that there also has to be this exploration of settler stories and critiquing them. And so the settler stories have a very, very good way of reinforcing the colonial ideologies and racism. So I think we also need to deconstruct those settler stories that really prop up the views of Indigenous people, you know, particularly around even the slave trade. That was governed by the Doctrine of Discovery. All of those things really need to be critiqued. So I think storytelling can be a very powerful tool for Indigenous voices, but also to really pick apart how settler colonialism continues to be reified in our society through narrative. Because really, history was affirmed by the colonizer. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe. So I learned a lot the last 12 months because not only building on the work that I've done the past 30 years, bringing different cultural groups together to learn about each other and co-create, you know, cultural activities for all Calgarians to enjoy and to raise awareness and to break boundaries. I also learned that the experience of the more established Asian Canadian groups like the Japanese and the Chinese are very different from the current and the lived experience of the Filipino community, the Vietnamese and the Korean communities. So I think the culture-specific intervention is real, is very much needed. It's a form of respect, you know, of our diversity. And then if you think about some of those groups that I've been working with very closely recently, storytelling and sharing experiences, joy, different kind of emotion through cultural activities are natural and it's safe for them. So festivities such as Asian Heritage Month is a great opportunity for people of all backgrounds to actually learn about each other, learn about each other's experience. But interestingly, the last 10 days, I was approached by the City of Calgary, the Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, many others, actually asking the ACT Foundation, asking the ACT to End Racism Network, what are you doing this May that we could actually collaborate with, that we could amplify? Interestingly, I went back to talk to the communities because I meet with them every Monday afternoon, and everyone said, this year, the focus have to be on anti-Asian racism. So enough of the song and dance and the food. Those are still very important, but we have to find different ways to talk about racism. Yeah. So very important. Thank you.
Art, so I can't let that question sit there, being on the board of Arts Commons. Art is the way that we communicate as a culture and as a people before we even have a language. It is, I think Nina Simone said something to the effect of, it's the artist, and the artist's job is to tell the political story and to tell the story of social justice and change. And we're seeing that. We saw it in a very unfortunate way when I think about the conversation and the vitriol and reaction that happened this summer in Calgary with the mural for Black Lives Matter. But I'm quite chuffed about the result. That mural is beautiful by Jay Sterling and his team, And I think Pink Flamingo, as the facilitators of that work, are to be commended for their leadership, for their patience, for their resilience and their perseverance. Like let's be quite clear. Like some of the leadership with Pink Flamingo, and they're a QT BIPOC artist collective, fold, strange. I'm putting labels on them, but I just call them like a flock. They were receiving death threats, and I'm thinking, how is this happening over a picture? But it was an important picture then. So we can't devalue the importance of artists and creativity and the production of art to tell our story of transformation when it comes to anti-racism.
And the missing history.
And the missing
amongst
history.
the different people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, not captured, not told yet.
Nile, did you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
And I'll just add that, I mean, ultimately, when you talk about the arts, it's about freedom. It's freedom of, it's the clearest example of freedom of expression. And so the mental health, I guess, healing that it probably allows the participants and the creators to actually have, because it's often an expression of, all of the frustration of dealing with constraints from systemic racism in other areas of their life. That to release that and tell the story is actually it's uplifting, not just for the audience who can be informed more, but actually for the participants. So
it's catharsis in action.
And so thanks for those comments on the arts, but that leads to another question by Elaine Ward, and that question is really, it's framed in terms of the tiki torches, and the fact that they are reflective of the KKK, but I would say they remind us of the demonstration in Charlottesville, United States. And the invocation of them is as a symbol of hate. And while we can think of the tiki torch, we can think of the Confederate flag, which is associated with slavery. We can think of the damage to the Black Lives Matter mural. All of these examples illustrate the ways in which symbols, and either the defamation of symbols or the destruction of them or the creation of them are important in the struggle for freedom. But also are important ways of telling a story also. The question really is about how should we respond to these symbols that are associated with racism? What should be done about them? The tiki torches, the Confederate flags. What should be the legal but also the social or moral responses to these kinds of symbols?
I'll take the opportunity to start with that one, Dr. Smith. So I'm kind of known for dealing with.
Heather's got an incredible Confederate flag story from the before times.
From the before times. So I'll let people look that one up. But I'm going to reflect on the comments that I actually made at the hearings in July. And it was a question, but it's more just a process. So I look at the collaboration and the really successful thing that happened between Bylaw, Calgary Police Service, and Councillor Carra, Councillor Davidson, Councillor Woolley to get that flag down with haste. And is there an opportunity, thinking about the work that Nile's doing on the Anti-Racism Action Committee and with Bylaw, to think about, is there a way to actually prevent the sale of a Confederate flag in Calgary? And I'm not saying you gotta, trumps on people's rights and blah, blah, blah. Like, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying no one needs a Confederate flag in Calgary, and no one needs to sell one. Mm-hmm. What purpose would you have for it? Mm-hmm. Except to incite hate. Mm-hmm. It is a clear, undeniable hate symbol. So I think that's exactly where we need to be. We need to be able to say, this is a clear, undeniable hate symbol, and address that. We need to actually make it unavailable. And we need to say that it's unavailable to folks. And when they actually show up magically, as they do, we take them down. And we say, no, not on our watch.
I'm gonna push you on that because in
Yeah.
a way, whether it's the Confederate flag or the tiki torches or the symbols from Nazism, other symbols from Nazism, which are selling in stores, that necessarily leads to questions around expression and choice and these kinds of things. And so, how does one? I mean, in a way, in your comments, there was a suggestion of the need for literacy and education and awareness around these kinds of things.
Absolutely.
So, what actions? And then another one is to say you can't do, but of course that runs into questions of rights and freedoms. So, what are the other ways in which one can? Because it seems to me some people does everyone understand the significance of these? Many do.
Many do. Many do not. So there's always the challenge of the teaching and the education. And I get to the place where I start to wonder how tired do I need to be? And I see Teresa smiling, I see Vicky smiling, because honestly, like, I think specifically, and no offense now, but I think every woman of color is like exhausted after this summer of teaching and explaining and providing all of the perspective and the context and, the patience and, oh, well, I know that you're not trying to be mean. I know you're not purposely racist. I know that I understand you. I'm your friend. But this is where we are in 2021, in 2020, in 1992. I'm tired. Got dark circles under my eyes. I think you get to a place where if you cannot educate to an extent, you have to legislate. And I didn't mean to rhyme like that and sound like Johnny Cochran, but I think you need to legislate, and that is how you get to a place. The tiki torches are going to be way more challenging because that's a legitimate garden accessory. But there is no purpose whatsoever for Confederate flag in Calgary.
I think that's the balance that our institution have to actually take into consideration. There's always a need for cross-cultural understanding. There's always a need, to educate. But after 40 years, there's also a need to actually get on with systemic change. So I think that the two can happen and take place simultaneously. But the cross-cultural awareness is always easier to do than the systemic change. So I think that's what the challenge are for our institutions. But when you talk about this, I think that the simple definition for systemic discrimination is defined by impact, not intent. So what is the impact of hate? When actions taken by hate group is meant to intimidate, it is meant to lay fear. So who's impacted by this? Right? So it should be defined by the people who are impacted.
It's meant to challenge our ability to thrive, our ability to prosper, and our ability to live in community with one another.
Yeah. So I think the institution's responsibility, it reminded me of the time I participated in the name change for the Chinaman's Peak, which is now Harling Peak. So it opened my eye. But then it was good for the public actually to learn about the different perspectives. And then at the end, the institution made a decision, right? And so I learned that day that for some people, the term Chinaman is a term of endearment. Well, to whom? So, so they were there to defend it. But it was good. It was good deliberation, citizen deliberation. So we learned about the different perspective. And at the end, then those have the power, have to make a decision.
I'll just jump in on that. I totally agree. I mean, there's no point discussing with white supremacists whether or not that the flag is hurtful. I mean, it's right there for everyone to see. All right, this is a flag associated with KKK and slavery and executions of black people, and so it is what it is. But I've been thinking about this because I do have a different view. The tiki torches, it is. I think what's interesting is you can see who's carrying it, right? So if someone shows you who they are, accept it. Because if they're carrying it to a picnic, it's a very different reason than if you're carrying it at an anti-mask rally, apparently that's been taken over by white supremacists in many ways. I think on the flip side, the Confederate flag, you know, sometimes I guess, you know, people got it on their trucks with swinging testicles on the back and whatnot. And I'll tell you, it is intimidating. When I was a young boy, I was intimidated by any vehicle I saw with a Confederate flag, you know, but so it is what it is. And so there's that level of fear as well, and it's someone showing you who they are. But in the instance with the cemetery recently, that one's a little bit, it's eerie because it was just left there for all to see, you know, at a place where people should be free to, you know, mourn their loved ones and, you know, feel the most at peace and find peace. And it was put there, replacing the Canadian flag. So I think exposure is interesting. And so when you talk about legislation, it'd be creative use of a city bylaw or maybe even a bigger piece of legislation where, okay, to protect and balance freedom of expression, if you want to purchase that flag, put your name in a registry, you know, so we can start to the police can start there with an investigation instead of just this broad, it could have been anyone. Because it could have been some punk kids, or it could have been a racist leader of a company, of a business. So let's start there. Oh, your vehicle was seen, but you're on the registry for purchasing a Confederate flag. And it would maybe hasten the investigation and maybe discourage people from this like obnoxious behavior. Yeah. So, you know, let's go. That's what I would say. It's time to just adequately address these things.
So, yeah, I've thought a lot about the Confederate flag and responses that City Council might take, and we will be discussing this on Monday for sure, and I really appreciate the insight. Next question is from Josie Guo, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, but it's for Vicky, and it's going from sort of like micro legislation to a much broader question. And what Josie poses is that are there additional legal doctrines with a similar significance and scale to the doctrine of discovery that can be applied when dismantling settler colonialism through jurisprudential analysis and action? Like, what do we replace?
It's a Friday.
The doctrine of discovery.
We only have 14 minutes left, so.
And it's a Friday. That's
yeah, that's right.
That's a thesis question, man. Wow, okay, go.
Yeah, I think this is what we're after. Really, fundamentally, I think all of the things that we've said right here for, you know, the Police Act to be assessed, every act, so Education Act, Police Act, Societies Act, like every micro that forms the larger Canadian fabric needs to be assessed and revised with the thought of anti-racism. And I think what I was thinking about the tiki torches, I'll never look at a tiki, I'm never gonna buy one. However, we also need to implement protective policy. Because what I hear, you know, I said this earlier at the beginning, is that right now, so many policies and procedures protect the racist, not the people that are being, abused or violated by the racist acts. And so I think that if, we're really looking at an overhaul, it would include redefining Canada. And if we're going to redefine Canada, then Canadian sovereignty is at stake. And that would be a huge, huge issue, because then there would be no claim to Canada from the government. And I'm digressing, because I think it's that large. I think it's really every law, and I think Heather said this, every law is permeated by racism, because it was inherently set up for settlers. Like when we're talking about the police in 1885 was established to protect settlers from
runaway slaves and
Indigenous people and, people of color that were seen as a threat. So I'm not answering her question, because I think it's too big for me to say, and I think it would literally take every single person in Canada to assess their own racism, to admit that they're racist, and then start there. Because I think even what Nile was talking about, even the police commission admitting, or the police force admitting, that's only the first step. and then we go from there.
I'm going to give you a practical example for what Vicky so articulately expressed there. So let's think about something like the Forest Act, okay? And I'm going to pick on Saskatchewan because I'm going to get a whole bunch of comments after this, but let's look at the Saskatchewan Forest Act. There is an actual requirement that allows you to cut down a living tree no taller than 4 meters. Why somebody needs a 13-foot Christmas tree, I don't know, for the purpose of celebrating Christmas. No other holiday, no other religious context is provided. We have embedded our bias into our legislation. Giancarlo's looking at me going, wow.
But I think that's, sorry Nile, that's fundamentally how our relationships are defined with each other, and even fundamentally with land. And land is at the root of colonialism. So then we're going to have to really look at what our relationship with land is. Are we allowed to cut a tree down to put in our living room? And then have it sized.
Like, so now people are going to talk about like how we're trying to cancel Christmas. No.
Yeah,
I mean, look directly to the camera. No.
No, but I think it's that minute. It is that minute where every, Christianity and Catholicism has been the bedrock to understand what we celebrate, what we don't, what we privilege, what we don't. And so until we really explore that, particularly around land is very contentious, because if you don't,
So there's a practical example, QED.
I wrote a paper about this in law school, actually, and there was pushback there. I was like, it's just an idea. I don't know. It doesn't affect me. I was raised a Catholic and Christian, but I just was pointing it out. I'm like, why do bank holidays? How do we acknowledge holidays? Maybe a flexible organizational structure so that anybody can celebrate their holiday. I wrote about it, and that's what it takes. I think it takes someone who shouldn't be affected by it. You shouldn't have to be affected to understand that it affects others. And so, that was me demonstrating and people were acting like, my professor, I think, was Christian, and she could tell there's pushback. I'm like, no, I'm Catholic. Let's do this. I'm just saying, you can't go to the bank on Christmas. Well, why not Kwanzaa? Why not Eid? But anyways,
the questions are coming in. So I want to combine a couple of questions, if we will, and actually what's clear with all of the questions is there's some questions about what do we need to do in order to ensure concrete inclusion. So there's a lot of discussion about anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Love the talk, but no practice. So people want to know what is necessary to ensure we address, as part of the efforts to address systemic racism, we talk about what that means in health and medicine. There are others who want to say, well, how do we talk about community engagement, but many immigrants or racialized minorities continue not to be included in activities. What do we need to do to address that? And so I'm just going to let you answer any of these questions as you want to get into it. But also, you can think about, and now if you want to speak to what the City of Calgary's Anti-Racism Action Committee is doing around these questions, that would also be welcome as well. So.
Well, what I'd say is we're attempting to address these, and it's attempting to point out where we can be most effective. The committee just was formulated late last year, and so we don't meet that often, especially in the challenges of a pandemic. However, it's about really efficiently thinking of the ways we can do that right away, but to target specific areas. Like, for example, we get a lot of questions coming at members in relation to oversight of police, for example. And I don't think it's necessarily, as important a topic as it is, I don't think it's necessarily the right, we might not have the tools specifically to address that with the Anti-Racism Action Committee. And that's just is what it is. However, it's having the conversations, and it's attempting to understand that we're supposed to do a lot of things. We're supposed to engage the community with the strategy, but we're also supposed to engage the organization on its policy. And so it's trusting the membership, I think, my fellow committee members, to pinpoint their expertise and their insights and their communication with members of the public, as well as collaborating with city administration. So, I mean, we're still trying to figure it out, how to do it best. And I think that's fair enough. And as much as people want immediate change and immediate measurable responses, that's what it takes sometimes to collaborate and identify. But for example, GC mentioned that we kind of made a proclamation of support for the Guidebook for Greater Communities. And we had some membership give some concrete improvements. And it being a living document, there might be a chance to address some of those later. However, it's just supporting it, even if it might not be the end game that we would advise, I think it's still better, you know, it's lesser of two evils, so to speak. So it's identifying just the slight areas where you can sometimes have an impact, but not address the broader concern.
Go.
Thank you. I believe in setting goals. I like numbers. So what gets measured gets done. So I'm a believer of that. And having spent time, decades dealing with institutions inside and outside, I have learned that institutions are very good at giving money, telling other people to do the work. When the language they tend to use for themselves is foster, encourage, So I like setting clear goals, measurable outcome. So that is also linked to race-based data, because we know that the Chinese Canadian women have the lowest level of trust with our public institutions, police and elected officials. We know that racialized Canadians have lower health outcomes, and also I mean, one of the stereotypes that's working against Asian Canadian is this model minority myth. But what people do not look at is that a lot of them are also not finishing school and ended up in prisons right now. So our institutions tend to talk about what 80% of the people that participated in the evaluation are very happy. But what about the 20%? So 75% are very satisfied. What about the 25%? So it is time to talk to the 25, the 30% of the people to find out, what their experience and perspectives are. So I believe in public accountability, and beyond the committees, they always do good work. But when I say public, is talk to the impacted community. So and that's also a way to link meaningfully between the community and our institutions. So banquet is nice, but let's talk about real issues.
Okay. I always talk in threes. It's like a trust. It's like a trust. It's strong, the engineer in me. So first, don't do business with racists. Really, really simple principle. So example of how that works, you've got a corporate travel policy, from the before times, and you rock up to the hotel and they treat you badly, and it's straight up racist. So now what do? You have to stay there, because if you don't get reimbursed by your company for your time. But what you actually should be able to do is go back to your corporate travel department and say, yeah, you know what, we can't do business with this particular hotel chain because they treat our people badly and they're racist. And then your corporate travel policy people would actually remove that business relationship. And then they would actually tell the world, we no longer do business with hotel chain XYZ because they're racist. Don't do business with racists. 2, collect race-based data. Every woman in this room knows the impact of not having gender-specific data in healthcare. We weren't studied at all, except for perhaps for childbirth and reproduction, and even then it was kind of sketchy. How we can in the after times not have race-based data and an approach to understand how COVID manifests in the full plurality of our population is beyond me. And how issues manifest in the full plurality of our population is beyond me. Collect race-based data. Have this conversation with everyone that you engage with. So you should be having this conversation at the soccer team when you're handing out the little oranges. You should be having this conversation at church and at temple and at mosque. You should be having this conversation with your neighbors at the barbecue that you're not supposed to be having because you're not supposed to be gathering more than 10 in COVID. You should be having this in the summertime when you meet as a family for ceremony and powwow. You should be having this conversation in the backyard when you're going to go sail and you're going to go float down the river as you're collecting. You should be having it when you're picking rocks. You should be having it when you're mowing the lawn.
And I'll
Sorry.
when I'm mowing the lawn. But I think, sorry, to pick up on that is I think you have to have a conversation with yourself while you're mowing the lawn about exactly what we're talking about. And then, I think too, don't rely on people of color to have that conversation with. Because going back to what Heather was talking about, you know, we're exhausted. Like, we go to dinner parties that we're not supposed to go to and we get asked those questions, and then I stop going to dinner parties, you know? So, but the last thing I'll say is I think we also have to be careful of our language, particularly about inclusion, and what does that suggest. I was, you know, listening to Ibram Kendi, Dr. Kendi, and he was talking about sometimes discrimination can lead to equity if it is done properly. And so we have to think about why we're including, what are we including, and what does that look like?
So I want to thank you all for this really fruitful discussion.
We weren't able to get to all of these amazing questions.
There are many more questions I know we didn't get to, but we're nearing the end of this panel discussion today. Much of our discussion has been focused on what we can do to address systemic racism within our structures and institutions. Racism is not just an issue for people of color, for BIPOC, it is an issue for all of our society, for all of our institutions. To find a solution, we all need to play a role in it, in anti-racism activities. As a final question, for the audience, I would like for us to think about what we can all do to fight racism. What can we all commit to during today to help propel forward an anti-racism work within the institution in which we work and within the city of Calgary? So, to each of you, I wonder if you would offer your 3 recommendations on what we can do.
Well, as everyone sort of sits around.
Nile,
Okay.
take it away for us.
So,
You got to fight the power. That's what you got to do. To quote Spike Lee.
or offer 1 recommendation each.
You know, I'll speak to it
Okay.
as a white person because I think it's a really difficult shift because we want to make room and we want to listen and participate, but we also don't want to exhaust the hell out of you. And, you know, I always tease the mayor, why haven't you solved systemic racism yet? You've been a mayor for 10 years. And, you know, he smacks me upside the head, as I absolutely deserve for being so impertinent. I think what I'm committed to doing is putting this front and center. And, you know, I'll get a lot of blowback on social media from people saying, you know, you're just doing this for votes. And I'm like, not really sure it's the best vote sort of strategy, but it's absolutely necessary. So this is going to be hard and exhausting work, but it's absolutely essential to be the people who I think so many of us believe we are as Canadians. We've pointed out our shortcomings, and it's time to, you know, as Nile said, fight the power. It's time to roll up our socks and get ready to go, because we've got work to do together.
Okay.
As tired as I am, the question always comes to me, if not me, then who? So this is my work. I'm here. I'm going to do it.
Me too. I know that I won't stop. Sometimes I wish I would take a break, but I will continue to work. First word that came to mind was to empower each other. But I'm also going to borrow something I learned from a group of artists, and which is to turn the phrase "speak truth to power" to "power, speak truth."
Yes.
And, you know, I was always a big fan of Malcolm X, and one of his lines is "by any means necessary." And that has been a rotating interaction in my head over the years. Well, like I said, as a child, I was fearful of the Confederate flag. Probably still am, I guess. If I was out in the woods and I saw one hanging there with a burning cross, it'd terrify me too. But then in my youthful years, I would see them and I'd rip them down. I'd pull them right off of cars. And that might not be, that's criminal, but I'm just saying. And now I'm offering maybe forms of legislation, to interact with it. So I think it's trusting my peers and my community members, be them minorities or be them GC. It's that we all have different ways to impact this journey, and so it's not up to me to do it all, right? And so you just trust that everyone's going to keep on pushing and show resilience and show effective ways of combating it. And so trust everyone here to do that, and I trust everyone viewing along to do it, and the broader community as well.
Yeah, and I think I have the exact same sentiments. I say to my friends, and I try and strive to surround myself with people that want the same outcome as I do, because it can be tiring doing it alone. And so I have sort of harvested this really strong group of people that when I'm tired, then they'll step in, and vice versa. And so if we can do that and amplify that to a larger collective where it's not only a small pool of people doing it, but we can be stronger together and keep each other accountable.
Thank you. So thank you all for your reflections on the hearings on systemic racism 1 year on. Thank you to the audience who online and for attending. Everyone who joined us today, we had many thought-provoking questions, and we apologize for not being able to get to all of them. As you heard, our work is only beginning. We will be sending out links to some additional resources and a recording of today's event. So please keep an eye out in your inbox. I urge you all to take on some of the outstanding examples you just heard on what we can do as individuals, but also as members of communities and in our institutions to support anti-racism work. It is work, and it means not just being colorblind, it means not just being non-racist, it means actually being actively anti-racist. We need your help to bring the change we all want to see in our community. We also need you and the rest of us to be the change we want to see in the world. Thank you.